So anyways, the first genetically modified mosquitoes released in the U.S. to buzz in the Florida Keys. That's the headline.
And don't mistake this for the first mosquitoes that could be troublesome to be released, because they released them with dengue fever.
What?
Yeah. They were released above Louisiana and the Florida coast with dengue fever by the thousands, with the idea that I think that they're doing the same thing with this, I'm sure, with the idea that the dengue fever would
What is dengue?
well,
fever?
it's tragic for humans.
Oh.
It's commonly found in the tropics.
Where'd they release it at?
Louisiana.
Okay, well, this one's
Florida
in Florida.
coast. Yeah.
This is for the Florida man. So this is last Thursday. A British company released basketball-sized cardboard boxes into 6 yards in the Florida Keys. So, like, I guess in people's houses. And if you're looking at the screen, there's a picture of it. It's called Oxitec, and it looks like a fancy planter, like a 6-sided cardboard box with pretty green coloring and whatever. But anyways, so they released 12,000 male Aedes aegypti. Didn't stumble at all. Mosquitoes.
Not at all.
Now, these are all males, and so they're non-biting males, but what they want to do is hope that these males breed with the females to produce non-sustainable, non-living mosquitoes. And I don't know, are these males just better looking, but they've been vasectomied? I don't get it, because there's still other males, or do they just expect that over time this will breed the mosquitoes out of population?
Do mosquitoes serve a purpose?
But they released 12,000 males, and the mosquitoes, they can't reproduce, so they're not going to reproduce and propagate more non-biting mosquitoes. So are they just hoping to overwhelm? Do they just want to make it so that the bug zapper like runs your electric bill through the roof? What's the plan?
Well,
or are they going to do this every year?
I think the question is, what happens to the wildlife that eat these mosquitoes? And then what happens to the wildlife that eat the mosquitoes?
This is like non-breeding mosquitoception.
Yeah.
The dream within a dream. So local officials say they argue the trial is necessary at a time when pesticides are increasingly ineffective against these dangerous pests. A 2016 vote on the project indicated a solid majority of support in most of the surrounding counties. In most, that means your neighbor county might not agree.
I mean, in a solid majority. Did they hold an election and decide? How do they know a solid majority?
How do you broach that at the county meeting? So what we're going to do.
Yeah. Anyway.
It just makes me, there's that. And there's, will it actually work? If they're non-breeding mosquitoes, how does that work?
Yeah. Sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Quit messing with nature. Quit messing with the weather. It's just a terrible idea.
Yeah. How would that work? If they don't breed, they won't propagate to further not breed. I mean, if they can invent a mosquito that doesn't suck blood, that'd be great, or one that drinks coconut milk. None of us need that shit. That's nasty. Anyway, so let's go on. So, this show's got a focus point, but we're going to start out with kind of a general overlook. And we're reading in ATI, History, Science, News, humana. So we're talking the letterhead of this is the six, most heinous or evilest human experiments perpetuated by the U.S. government. And we've even got an experiment in here that's really not perpetuated by the U.S. government, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so first we are going to start off with the mustard gas experiments. And this is right at the end of World War I. Australia did it, but the U.S. also did it. The U.S. didn't know for sure whether the mustard gas would be 100% effective during combat situations, how long it lasts, what were the effects, were the soldiers usable after, all that other stuff. So the Brits did it. I'm sure Germany did it as well. But so the U.S. grabbed its own soldiers and did some human experiments to test the effects of mustard gas on otherwise healthy young men. So in Panama in 1942, they grabbed and mustard gas, to explain, is an oil-based chemical weapon. So what it means is it lingers. You got aerosol-based and water-based and other stuff, but oil-based hangs out. So they'll spray a field with it, and it will linger. It has a half-life of however long it takes to get the mustard washed off. So the gas is a sticky, oily resin that causes chemical burns on exposed skin and uncontrollable bleeding in the lungs when it's inhaled. And the Army did not ask consent from its soldiers in Panama in 1942. So this is right at the beginning of World War II. I mean, just, a year before we start really getting involved. Well, before we send guys to get involved. The purpose of the test was to work out how well mustard gas would work in tropical environments such as the islands that American soldiers would soon be fighting across in the Pacific. Perhaps as many as 1,200 recruits tested in small teams for several weeks were ordered to strip to the waist outside of a wooden chamber on base grounds, then sent inside and doused with the agent. It turns out that mustard gas works really well in tropical heat.
Yeah, as it mixes with the sweat and the humidity.
Your pores are open. According to one survivor, all the men began writhing around and screaming in pain as the chemical burned through their skin. Some pounded on the walls and demanded to be let out, though the doors were locked and only opened when the time was up. Though the men were treated immediately following the experiments, they were threatened with military prison if they ever disclosed what had happened to anyone, including their own doctors later in life. When the story finally broke in 1993, more than 50 years after the test, only a few survivors could be located for compensation. The Pentagon is still officially looking for test survivors, the youngest of whom would now be 93 years old. So that's a shady,
that is heinous.
That's a shady
They're
thing.
screaming and writhing in pain in there. And what you'll find with the commitment to these experiments is they become subjects and lose humanity. The people that are being experimented on just become information points for these experiments. I can't imagine if someone is writhing in pain, screaming, pounding on the door to get out. I don't know how you justify leaving the door closed, but in all of these experiments, that is the case.
Oh, yeah. So we got the Guatemala syphilis experiment. Okay, disease has traditionally been more than a threat to soldiers than any weapon of the enemy. And that is true. Disease is horrible. World War I was, you read about the story of Verdun and guys would fall in those tepid water pits with disease in them, and it would kill them like quick within a day, 2 days. And these are craters from where the shells landed. And that's just the tepid water with all the death in it.
Not to mention, what the Viet Cong did, and
Oh,
it's
the
it's
punji stakes.
yeah, it's been used. Understanding how fragile the human body is, it's been used in every war in one aspect or another.
Yeah. So syphilis is apparently a pretty rough disease. Apparently nowadays it's not a problem, but back before penicillin, it was a crippler. It was
It caused lots of things. It caused memory loss. It caused paralyzation. It caused all kinds of terrible body pain, and it was deadly.
Doesn't it cause lesions on the brain or something as well?
Well, the lesions with syphilis are not found in the brain until autopsy. However, lesions on other parts of the body are very prominent.
Don't look at it.
Yeah.
So anyway, after World War II, government scientists, along with researchers from Johns Hopkins, the Rockefeller Foundation, and one of the predecessor companies of pharmaceutical giant Bristol Myers Squibb, set out to study the spread and effects of, among other diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea. Unfortunately, they chose unwitting test subjects in Latin America for their human experiments, and some of them were children. Little is known about the Guatemalan VD studies because the research generated no papers for peer review, and almost all government records were destroyed some years after the program concluded in 1956. So if they started right after the war and went to 1956, this could be a 7-year-long study.
Yeah.
We do know, however, that the project started with deliberate exposure of Guatemalan men to infected prostitutes. Imagine this. First of all, the scientists go and find infected prostitutes.
Yep.
And then they bring the prostitutes to the men. And then...
So they were inoculating these patients with tinctures outside of that, with infected material.
Well, yeah, when it didn't spread infections quick enough, doctors from the project partnered with local physicians and inoculated patients with tinctures. What is a tincture? Is that ointment?
Yeah. Well, they're placing it directly onto the genitalia or injecting it, sometimes into the spine.
Oh, good heck. Children as young as 8 were given shots that were later to discover to have been hot with STDs, and their health was then charted. Some subjects were given penicillin, the lucky ones, which was already known to be effective in treating both types of STIs, but others were left untreated to study the progression and damage caused by the infections.
Very similar. It's interesting because there's the Tuskegee experiment, which we're going to go into a little more in depth about.
That's kind of the main point of it. We're just kind of getting a little rub out.
Right. But it's interesting.
I shouldn't have said rub. This is a bad subject to talk about with that.
It's interesting how the Tuskegee experiment started to catch a little heat, and then these experiments show up in Guatemala. That's why we say it's not necessarily here, but I guarantee you we had some hand in it. The United States government, the CDC to be more specific, had to have had some hand in it.
That's just, yeah. Yeah, they were all in on that. All in. Man, all right. So we got the human experiments, the Manhattan Project's fatal radiation.
Mm-hmm.
So a Manhattan Project researcher recreates a demon core that accidentally killed one of the project scientists when physicist Louis Slotin dropped a beryllium shell over a plutonium core by accident. So, okay.
The Manhattan Project was interesting because they built a city to produce an atomic bomb, and I don't think they set out to produce an atomic bomb. What they wanted to do was produce a weapon of mass destruction, and that's where it ended up. But it was a city. It was this little town that you couldn't come and go from, that families lived in.
Yeah, well, yeah, it became an overnight military scientific base. Anyway, so project scientist Harry Dahlian, Daghl,
Dalian. Mhm.
Dahlian, man, look at me go, triggered a sudden burst of radiation from a plutonium core he was working on and exposed himself to a fatal dose of gamma rays that killed him 25 days later.
I'm sure those 25 days were hell.
Oh, man. Yeah. Radiation poisoning seems rough.
Your toenail, first you lose your hair, like kind of the soft surfaces. Those that were near Hiroshima and those that were near Chernobyl, they experienced in the first couple of days complete hair loss, and then they lost their toenails and their fingernails, and then all of their teeth fell out.
So like the radium girls we talked about last year.
It's devastating, and there's no stopping it. It's a freight train. You can't take it back out. Once you've been exposed, you've just been exposed, and you shed it to people around you, so you have to be isolated.
I read about a scientist in the USSR's atom collider that they had built. He went in there and it fired and it shot a particle into his head.
Good Lord.
It didn't kill him. It just made him deaf and blind in one eye and ear. Anyways, so he's dying for 25 days, but instead of treating him, they covertly observed him to chart his decline in death, to get some research notes. Instead of making him comfortable, they
watched.
They just watched.
In the name of science.
And so they didn't make it any worse, but
that's how they I guess excuse their behaviors, because they were on record as saying, well, he violated safety precautions and he shouldn't have been doing this, and he knew what he was getting into, and there's really nothing we can do to spare his life. But they didn't offer him any pain medication. They didn't offer him even IV fluids. They watched him deteriorate. 25 days is really fast. Those that are exposed at really high levels often last several months, and are given heavy doses of pain medication to help keep them comfortable while their bodies deteriorate. They did not do that in this case.
All right, so there's another kind of in with this. At the reactor site at Hanford, Washington, the technicians were they didn't warn them along with the radium girls. They didn't warn these workers of the low-grade exposure they'd receive every day.
Yeah.
So in 1943, project staff suspected that some workers' physical ailments were related to their work. In the case of one worker, a woman suffering from kidney failure, an internal memo discussed whether or not to alert her to the potential cause: chronic exposure to radioactive plutonium.
Yeah.
Or polonium. There's a lot of EMs. It's an EM.
Yeah.
The decision was made to conceal the facts. Later, with help from the University of Chicago and California, and from the military hospital at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, living human patients were injected with polonium and other radioactive elements to study their effects on the body.
So they didn't just conceal the facts. They said, wow, this really may have an effect. Let's get some patients together and let's deliver a dose of this so that we can study the effect on the human body. I understand that the concessions need to be made to push science forward, to push healthcare forward. This is it. Most of these are just inexcusable.
Yeah, they started injecting them. Another one, a project scientist delivered a batch of radiosodium in a crate to the University of Rochester Medical School, then took it out to the alfalfa field next door, loaded it into sprinklers to study how it spread through the environment, and to work out shielding requirements to protect these students in adjacent buildings.
Well, we'll just shoot it out there and then we'll figure out how to protect them.
Eventually, hundreds of people, including 57 mentally handicapped children in Massachusetts and more than 100 disabled adults in Chicago, were fed or injected with plutonium, which holds the distinction of being one of the most dangerous substances in the world for human health.
Yeah.
And then from 51 to the early 70s, the Manhattan Project, later reorganized as the Atomic Energy Commission, gathered exposure data and tracked the fates of the unwitting test subjects.
These guys didn't give consent in any of these experiments. They were not told that this is what they were doing.
And
for a couple of reasons. One, nobody would sign up.
Yeah.
And two, it would skew the actual results.
Yeah. And now the files of this research are still classified and therefore unavailable to potential plaintiffs' lawsuits.
Yeah.
Yes. That's gross. Gross. Okay, now on to kind of the point of the beginning of the show. So, this is the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Happened here in the United States.
Yep, in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
The goal was to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in Black populations, but the subjects were completely unaware and were instead told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, when in fact they received no treatment at all.
Now, bad blood was a common term in Alabama in this time. This is poverty-stricken Alabama, and they had literally the highest rate of syphilis in men in their Black communities. It was 36%.
Yeah,
and they had the lowest education, so they called everything bad blood. So that's what they went into these communities saying is, we're going to test you for bad blood.
Yeah, we're talking 600 men from Macon County, Alabama, and they did a lot of shady stuff. One, they told them they were treating this, but they didn't. But the tests that they gave them tests, X-rays, spinal taps, and autopsies after they died. The goal was to observe the natural history of untreated illness. A couple things they did. Now, this started in 1932.
Mm-hmm.
It ended in 1972.
40 years.
40 years they kept this going.
20 years after we knew that penicillin cured it.
Yeah, a couple things they did. One, when some of the guys got drafted into the Army, the syphilis would be found in their physical and treated. So the researchers would jump ahead. And this is the Army. We're talking the Army for World War II, the Army for Korea, and the Army for Vietnam. The researchers would jump ahead and go tell the medical doctors, just, don't let them in, don't whatever, and kick them out.
Now, and we have to remember that back then the paradigm was different. The scientific community believed that Black people were different than white people as far as human response and anatomy. We were just completely different. So they chose to just study Black people, Black men in particular.
And also they probably started it because they felt they could get away with it. Sure.
But it was an impoverished community, and they started by putting up these signs for free health care. Mm-hmm. They would go into these communities that had no doctors, no health care, and they would offer them free health care.
And then when they didn't show up for health care, then they started coaxing them in with food and money and things like that. I mean, they coaxed them in. And so not only that, but these guys didn't go and seek health care because they thought they were receiving it.
Right.
It was horrible. They
also, as part of this experiment, it started out with the Public Health Service. And as part of this experiment, they intentionally found the few Black nurses, knowing that, one, they would never question what the doctor said because it was important to them to be an African American and be getting an education and given the opportunity to be a part of something that was, told to them that was really great and helping their community. Two, they were women, and they would never question a man,
especially a white man.
A white man in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
And three, they knew that they could persuade the Black men to not only join this experiment, but to stay in this experiment by engrossing themselves in their communities.
Yeah. It was horrible. But so as of today, there are still, I believe, 12 people. So this all came out in the New York Times in 1972. It got released. By this time, out of 600, only 74 of the test subjects were still alive, and 128 of them had died of syphilis or its complications.
And it's
40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been infected with congenital.
Syphilis is not just passed by way of sexual contact. It's also passed from mother to child. They knew this at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they had been approached by peers on several occasions, calling to question, one, there was no consent. Two, they weren't telling these men that were a part of this experiment that they had syphilis. They had tested their quote unquote bad blood and had found that they had syphilis, but they weren't treating them for it. And they were never told they had syphilis. And, in the interviews they did with some of the survivors prior to their death, the survivors said, that's a word we wouldn't have understood anyway. But they were never told they had syphilis. They were never treated for syphilis. Their treatment was to just maintain their being alive so that they could watch this horrible progression of the disease. And it got so bad that one of the researchers reported to the health service, their upper management, that they weren't seeing enough paralysis. And they thought that something had gone wrong, or maybe the Black men never got paralysis. And they were reportedly told, well, you've got to do a spinal tap to really see the progression of the disease.
Mm-hmm.
So these men were told they were going in for a shot,
mm-hmm.
and they were given spinal taps, which are excruciating.
Well, and they were given some, not treatments, but like
they were checking their blood
They were
pressure.
giving them old school treatments like mercury. And so they would inject, I guess that was the treatment before penicillin, is they give you mercury. So, good luck with that. And they would do some of that. They would give them a lower dose than would be given prior to penicillin to treat it, even though I highly doubt it treated it then. But and maybe that was to test to see if mercury actually had an effect. I mean, the
whole purpose of the experiment was to monitor what happened, to record it, to time it, and to prove that the Black population had different symptoms or different symptom paths than the white population when it came to syphilis.
In the beginning, it was written all over with prejudice. I mean,
100%.
They started this. I don't know how it was in the end, but they kept it.
There was an interview with the lead doctor before he passed away, and the Associated Press contacted him, and I listened to the interview this afternoon kind of in preparation for this, and they asked him if he would do anything different. He said no.
Yeah.
And they said, well, these people suffered, and he said, well, it was for a good cause.
What's the good cause?
And for 20 years, the scientific community was effectively treating syphilis with penicillin, relieving all symptoms,
curing
and
it.
curing the disease, and they chose not to use that on these people in this experimentation.
If they'd come out with a cure for cancer out of the deal, okay, I could write it off as a good cause. But just to watch it kill someone, that's not a good cause.
And it's painful. It's really painful. And they settled. They actually settled the lawsuit.
In 72, when that came out, there was mass public outrage. The NAACP launched a class action lawsuit, and they settled the suit in 74 for $10 million and agreed to pay the medical treatments for all surviving participants and infected family members, the last of whom died in 2009. There's still...
and that was a shit show, because in Alabama, if the father was not married to the mother, the children were not recognized. So according to Alabama law, if your dad was not married to your mom, even if you had contracted congenital or by birth syphilis, you wouldn't get the payout. And albeit it was a lot of money back then, but it was sad. It was $32,000 for actual people in the experiment and $16,000 for their dependents.
Well, and the rough thing is, I think there's still 12 people alive that receive, they get also in that care package, they get free medical care for the rest of their life, and they get their burials paid for.
Yeah. And that,
which is a small consolation prize, but there's still 12 people alive that are. What
they were doing was getting test results through autopsy.
Yeah. And
they would essentially know that this person was sick, leave them untreated intentionally, watch them deteriorate and die, and then they would go to their surviving family members and talk them into letting them do an autopsy so that they could get their test results.
Yeah, it's
in the United States.
It's a rough one.
Not that damn long ago.
It's well known. Well, yeah, it was. I mean, they ended it 3 years before I was born. You know, it's heinous. Here's another one that I think is, as far as I'm concerned, probably the worst of the bunch. Vanderbilt University was funded by U.S. Public Health Service.
Same exact group that did the Tuskegee.
They involved 820 poor pregnant Caucasian women. 820. And they were given tracer doses of radioactive iron in a cocktail drink. This was in Tennessee, and they worked with the Tennessee State Department of Health. They did not inform the women of what was in the drink, nor were they informed that they were part of an experiment. The radiation portion of the experiment was designed to study the absorption of iron during pregnancy under the direction of Dr. Paul Hahn. Vanderbilt researchers who re-examined the data in 63 and 64 claimed no significant difference in malignancy rates between exposed and non-exposed mothers, however. And that one, does that mean some of them were given iron, some of them were given iron with radiation? They
probably had a control group.
Yeah. A higher number of malignancies among the exposed offspring. 4 cases in the exposed group: acute lymphatic leukemia, synovial sarcoma, lymphosarcoma, and primary liver carcinoma. What's the difference between sarcoma, and carcinoma?
That's the the area of the cancer. These are all different types
Yeah.
of cancer.
Okay. Anyways.
But basically, the mothers were fine. There was no difference. However, the offspring
Yeah.
suffered from these
Yeah.
crazy cancers.
Yeah. So no cases were found in a control group of similar size. This led the researchers to conclude that the data suggested a causal relationship between prenatal exposure to Fe59 and the cancer. The investigators also concluded that Dr. Hahn's estimate of fetal exposure was an underestimation of the fetal absorbed dose.
They didn't recognize or didn't understand how much the fetus would get by way of how much they gave the mother.
Yeah. But they knowingly
Mhm.
gave these pregnant women radiation. Knowingly.
To just see what happened.
All right. We got to do another news story before we carry on with the last of the show.
Let's do a couple comments.
Oh, yeah. Let's run through those. Okay.
So Jennifer says, bad idea. I agree. It is a bad idea. Quit messing with stuff. I'm sure that was about the mosquitoes.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
quit.
Yeah.
Or at least do it in a controlled environment. Build yourself. What was that dome on that one show?
The Simpsons?
No. Where they get locked in it and it's...
The Simpsons?
No. The Simpsons did a recreation of it. But it's
dome?
an eco-dome. Build an eco-dome.
With what's his name?
Yes. It was supposed to be funny, and then he ate all the food. And
Yeah.
build yourself an eco-dome. Go nuts. Modify the weather. Watch what grows and doesn't grow. You know what? Ingest whatever the hell you want to. Release your stupid mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Don't use our atmosphere as your dome, dumbass.
Don't use us.
Don't use us as the test subjects.
Tiffany Howell also mentions the coof.
Yes.
We're not allowed to say that word, or are we? I don't know.
I don't know. I'm gonna say probably still not.
Yeah.
But let's go with the beer flu. So yeah, it's all sounding very familiar. That Big Brother would utilize the beer flu to push an agenda. And, you know, the beer flu V is not FDA approved. So, I mean, those taking it are test subjects.
Yes. It is awful. Jeremy says, Jeremy says, makes you wonder what Big Gov is testing now.
Yeah.
Dash.
Makes you wonder.
Yes.
Because this is a sordid history. These are not the conspiracy ones. These are the ones that are known facts.
These are public.
There are hundreds of conspiracy ones that we haven't even touched on.
The one that isn't conspiracy, but I think they've messed around is that one, the workers at the plant, because they classified everything. So the guys died and couldn't sue them when they knew that they were being subjected to it.
That's all on military installations.
Yeah.
So
Tiffany says, hopefully they're being judged by the man upstairs and get sent to hell for the BS.
Yeah.
Damn right.
I've always wondered, do they start out as evil, or do they fall into this drive to understand and they end up as evil? Like, are they just rotten shits from the birth? Or are they like innocent little children and then they like, I want a microscope. And then 10 years later, you know, how does this happen?
So the question is are they out watching the squirrels or pinning the squirrels to boards?
Yeah.
Jeremy says the difference now is people are lining up with full consent to partake in modern experiments. Yeah, they are. Not just that biodome. That's the word, Jeremy.
Biodome, that's it.
My arm is falling asleep from this little dog.
She's snoozing away.
That is right. Not only are they lining up, but they are.
It's conspiracy theory.
They're getting after you if you're not lining up for it.
Arguably, the media is this huge force. And the message is if you don't, you're killing grandma. If you don't, you can't get back to normal. If you don't, all of these things are being force fed. And
Okay, so we can finish this show out. I think we got in trouble. We switched over to a different program.
Apparently, perhaps.
Okay, so all right.
Perhaps the it got a little too hot for the
Maybe
sensors.
I don't know what happened. I
Mhm.
don't know. All right, Betsy, you were started telling the story real quick.
so the weird news I brought tonight was I didn't see it on the news. However, I had heard about it and I started doing some research. And China successfully launched the first piece of what will become a brand new space station on Thursday. Now, however, the rocket stages are kind of what holds the rocket upright. And when the rocket fires, it's supposed to release the stages and
Like on our space shuttle, you have the two rockets on the side of the big solid fuel tank.
Mhm.
And those are the first stage, and then, or maybe the second, or whatever order they say. And then those are the stages. That's what you're talking about, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep. Those actually were launched into space with the rocket. However, they're uncontrolled. So now what we have, interestingly enough, it's called the Heavenly Harmony. Doesn't seem very heavenly or harmonious. What we have now is the largest space junk falling to Earth in the next couple of days.
So, and you were saying these are like 10 stories tall?
They're about 10 stories tall, metric tons
And so
of metal and other stuff.
So they're not dropping off like ours drop off before it leaves the atmosphere, correct? They're used to just get that initial speed to release us from the surly bonds of gravity.
Yeah.
And theirs carry all the way up and then drop off as one big piece.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
they don't know where
basically-
it's going to land?
Right. There's a giant piece of space junk flying above our heads. And at some point over the next week or so, it's going to come down. Now, they say that it's moving extremely fast, completing an orbit of Earth every 90 minutes or so. And that makes predicting its re-entry location like impossible.
So if it lands on, say, someone's house, can that someone sue
The Chinese?
the Chinese?
No. I mean, unless... I mean, I don't even think if it lands on someone's house in China. Now, we are covered with a lot of water, so the likelihood that it will enter an ocean is pretty high. But, I mean, I would say just, keep your eyes to the sky for the next couple of days. It could land anywhere.
Stay loose. Get ready to dodge.
Stay loose.
You
Stay
know,
loose.
Stretch every morning.
Yes.
So Bill Gates is getting divorced from his wife.
Yes.
And you mentioned your theory is that
It has to
because-
do with assets.
because of all the flack he's doing it to hide his assets.
I don't know if he's going to hide it. I think he's just going to out in the open. Now they don't have a prenup. That was in the news. But I think what will happen in this case is that one of two things. Melinda has realized he's Dr. Evil, and she's
She
getting
doesn't
while the
like
getting's
living in
good.
Doesn't like living in the volcano.
Yeah, or two, he's
It's always
going
so
to,
hot.
in the divorce, give her the bulk of his assets, which
Mhm.
protects them from, future litigation.
Like all the farming land that he now owns.
Correct.
Largest owner of farming land in the United States. Okay. Anyway, so this popular mechanics, excuse the dozer, she's going into guard dog mode.
That's right.
Bill Gates will have to wait a while to block the sun. That's the headline. I love it. Scientists have postponed the billionaire-backed study of the controversial technology called solar geoengineering. Oh, just as quickly as it was announced, which we talked about, what, 2 weeks ago?
The different kinds of.
Yeah. A controversial solar geoengineering experiment backed by Bill Gates has been postponed till at least
Another year.
next year.
Come on.
Well, we're going to die. Anyways, so Dr. Evil and other private donors are supporting Harvard University's Solo Geoengineering Research Program, which had planned to launch a new study based in Sweden in June, researching the efficiency of blocking sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. The big old word, Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, or SCOPEX, aimed to see how a tiny amount of aerosol in a trial would influence the immediate surroundings. But now Harvard says it is delaying the study to examine the impact on Sweden itself.
Yeah, like build a biodome.
As well,
Dr. Evil, you've
as
got the money.
Indigenous Sami people who live in the region. So they are canceling that for another year. And
He'll be back.
yes, I mean, right now he's fuming around his cave. Makes you wonder if he has a table, right? With, all his henchmen gathered around. There's a prominent scientist that's on the TV all the time and some media personalities, and he's pushing buttons and they're falling in their chairs down into like a fiery pit with alligators in it that bite on them and stuff. I don't know. But anyway, so that is, being delayed. So we've got just a few more of these experiments to get through. We're going to make it quick. Hopefully, all this fun action of everything being messed up didn't ruin it. I'll edit it. It will be up on YouTube and all the podcatchers.
He'll masterfully piece it together. You won't. It'll be seamless.
Sure. In 1965, a dermatologist, Dr. Albert Kligman, got a hefty $10,000. Now in 65, $10,000 is very significant. That'd be like getting a, $5 million grant or something right now. Grant to study various chemicals on behalf of Dow Corning, Johnson & Johnson, and the U.S. Army. His particular brief was to observe how human skin reacts to harsh chemicals, a process known as hardening, though he also tested psychoactive drugs.
He knew
as
these
well.
were harsh chemicals. He got a grant to test it on humans.
The specific chemicals he was to test and many other details about his work are lost to history. In 1981, it was discovered that all of his notes and records had been destroyed. But we do know he drew test subjects from Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, where he described the inmates like so. All I saw before me were acres of skin.
Evil.
It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time.
I wanted to put harsh chemicals on them. When I seen them, I thought, oh.
One of the chemicals we know that Kligman was testing was dioxin, the active ingredient in Agent Orange.
And let's remind you, we knew at this time what Agent Orange did to crops.
Agent Orange came out during World War II. At the time, the military was crop dusting half of Vietnam with the stuff, and people in the spray zones were exposed over and over. The Pentagon was interested in what would happen to them, as was Dow, the manufacturer of Agent Orange. And Johnson & Johnson said, "You're testing on people? I want in.
Let's do it.
I want in. I want a piece of that action." To speed up his research in the human experiments, Dr. Kligman injected his victims with a reported 468 times the recommended safe dose of dioxin, which is known to work as a blister agent and systemic toxin. His eventual findings, if any, are not known because they destroyed all of his stuff.
Well, and let's be clear. It wasn't good.
No, and we
Nothing
don't know.
great happened.
We don't know what happened to the prisoners, who they were. They can't seek redress. They just had to.
They likely had no choice.
Yeah. They just had to die. And the doctor died. So, and the military poison tests. As early as 1942, people in the War Department whose job was to be paranoid about the security were worried about how wide open and vulnerable the United States was. On their recommendation, President Roosevelt, the hero, created America's first biological warfare bureau, officially to study the country's vulnerabilities and devise an appropriate response should Japan, Germany, or later the Soviet Union ever get the idea to spray some germs around the U.S.
We're just going to beat him to it, was his idea.
Unfortunately, the Bureau's methods of assessing vulnerability was to covertly attack those perceived vulnerabilities with germ warfare of its own. Over a period lasting 20 years, from 1949 to 1969, well-intentioned officials working for the Department of Defense repeatedly doused whole cities across America with chemicals, bacteria, and fungal spores that they were pretty sure
Harmless.
would be mostly harmless.
Mostly harmless.
One of the earliest of more than 200 tests took place in September 1950 when a U.S. Navy ship near San Francisco hoisted its fire hose and sprayed tons of bacteria into a bank of fog that was drifting over the city.
Go.
Later, government officials checked with local hospitals to see how many people had been infected. It turned out to be thousands, and one of them may have died as a result, but the human experiments kept going. They, to get more data about how biological attack might spread, project planners dusted rural areas with potentially carcinogenic cadmium, including several schools in Minneapolis. They went with a cover story that the military was experimenting with shrouding cities in smoke screens in case of nuclear attack.
Oh, that was the cover story. It's not a biological weapon.
I didn't know that nuclear rockets were aimed, like visually aimed, like they've got a
like a peep
they've
sight.
got sights down them.
The old iron sights. Oh, jeez.
In New York in 1966, agents threw light bulbs filled with bacteria onto the subway tracks to see if the whoosh of air from the trains would spread the contaminants.
Come on. 1966, you don't understand how air works?
Turns out it would. Samples dropped at 14th Street were found as far away as 59th Street.
Make it stop.
The bacteria, Bacillus globigii, a pathogen that causes food poisoning, also coated the clothes, skin, and hair of subway passengers. None of the people who were exposed knew what was going on, and nobody was ever punished.
Yeah. It's a sickening idea to think that, these are, Mengele would have loved this stuff. It's a sickening idea to think that they did this and may still do this. I get it. My original comment, build your dumbass a biodome, stuff it full of people you love, do what you do.
Yeah, they should have experimented on themselves. But anyways, sorry for the hiccup in the middle. I'll piece this together. Hopefully I can make it all sound and look good. But we will be back next Friday. And enjoy the well, actually maybe not next Friday. We may be back next Tuesday on a regular time. We might be, because the change is still kind of up in the air, but we'll stay loose. We'll make sure we advertise it, whatever we end up doing.
Yeah.
But thanks for joining us. Sorry about the hiccup.
You can't mention the 19. ever
Yeah,
again. We've got to. I mean, even the code words, they're looking for them, so
they're on us.
they're on to us.
Dum dum dum. Yeah.
Have a great week.
All right, thanks guys. Oh, and I got a fun show that's coming up in the next month or so. I want to talk about some bat experiments our government did.
Sounds good.
All right. So, but it doesn't have to do with disease. All right. Have a good night. Have a good week. Humana, humana. We'll see you guys later. Oh. Okay, I've got to find out if there is like a time limit on how much
Did it